Well, thank you. And Jeremy, thank you for giving the talk. Jeremy Howard is an art historian who since the 1980s has been mostly at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. He specializes in a mix of modern art, architecture and design from across Eurasia, from the Baltic to the Balkans, Siberia to Scotland. I was really impressed. And his books include Art Nouveau, International and National Styles in Europe from 1996, East European Art from 2006, and of course, Balkan Fabrications from Fra and Jessie Newbery's Serbian Turn from 2022. And that's the focus of his talk this evening. And I think that we should go over to you now, Jeremy, to lose no time.
Right. Thank you very much for that introduction, Carla. I hope everyone can hear me, and I'll try my best to share my PowerPoint in just a second. So yes, what you said is, I suppose, correct about me, Carla, and Balkan Fabrications is kind of a concluding publication as far as my university career, my 40 years in St Andrews is concerned. I retire next week after 40 years. So this is my last talk, and probably appropriate that gremlins attacked it. So anyway, I'll go to share the PowerPoint now so you don't have to look at me anymore. Yeah, so this book, Balkan Fabrications, which Sansom published, was a long time in its genesis. And I decided in the end to not go with an academic press, but to go with a private press who would do a good design job and do a good editorial job and produce a lot of color reproductions. And I felt that Sansom have done really well with that. So it's a long book. It's a winding path that I tread there. And I can hear some background conversations going on, but anyway, that's okay. The warp and the weft of the book, the fabrications of the book are multifold. And it's not a straightforward book. In some ways, it goes backwards. In some ways, it goes in all kinds of different directions to reach an endpoint, which is about art, it's about craft, it's about how the two maybe are indistinguishable from one another. It's about our definitions. But most of all, it's about Fra and Jessie Newbery and their ideas and their products of what we might term art. And the journey starts off in Dundee. At least it did for me quite a few years ago, when I walked into the McManus and saw the painting on the screen at the moment. Well, you see one fragment of the painting from the front cover there. If I click on to the next slide, you see the whole of the painting. Now, I was intrigued by this. It's only about a meter, just over a meter wide, a little bit less than a meter high. So horizontal and vertical. I mean, it's 120, I think, wide. And it's in the World Cultures, or Dundee in the World Gallery, rather than being in the Modern Art Gallery or the, the Trends of Modern Art Gallery at the other end of the McManus. And I've found it quite appropriate being there, really. But I wondered why it was there. And it's fairly close to a representation, a painting of a man in a kilt. And so there's this sense of traditions being evoked in its place, where it's hung for already a number of years. And the title attracted me, Serbian Women, because I've worked in Serbia a lot. I worked in Yugoslavia a lot, as well as the Balkans, as well as further east in Europe. And it intrigued me because of the costumes. The scarves, the head scarves didn't seem quite right to me. Neither did the entrance or the bench. And so I started to dig. And that digging led to a lot of kind of, I would say, unearthing of what Fra and Jessie Newbery were about. Now, we've got to remember that Fra Newbery, who painted this and who used Jessie's collection of Balkan costumes for it. Now, Fra had been headmaster, as he was sometimes known, of the Glasgow School of Art for many years. And I think maybe in the next 2 slides, you can see his status, if you like. He's a painter, first and foremost, but he's also a writer. He's also a lecturer. He's a great thinker. He's a great exhibition organizer. He's a great impresario, really. He brings international artists and international speakers to Glasgow. And he starts Charles Rennie Mackintosh off on his career path with the most prestigious and best loved, really, Mackintosh commission, the Glasgow School of Art itself, with its very sad, tragic loss in recent years. Nevertheless, you see in these images what Fra Newbery, in many ways, was responsible for. And he's showing in his sketch, actually, that's a sketch for a bigger group portrait of the committees that organized the Glasgow School of Art and the design of the new building. So Mackintosh was to have a central place in that painting. And so this sketch alone of Mackintosh is quite important, I think. But the painting by Griffenhagen too shows the stature of Newbery. Now, he was a man who performed. He was, in many ways, a performer per se. He loved playing with languages. He loved writing. He wrote pageants. He organized pageants in Glasgow and in Dorset, where he retired to and where he'd grown up, actually. He retired there to Corfe Castle in about 1918, 1919, so after the First World War. He had married a former student at the Glasgow School of Art, Jessie Rowett, who became Jessie Newbery, and she became head of needlework. And it's Jessie's input to my book, I think, that is as crucial as Fra's. That's why they both have a very prominent place. In fact, in a way, I tie the book up at both ends with Jessie's input. Jessie was a critical player in Fra's development, but one who hasn't had that sense of recognition that she should have. In fact, Fra too has been highly neglected. And that double neglect led me to write this book, coupled to my own particular interest in the way they started to perceive the Balkans after their retirement and their move to Dorset, and they're starting to travel to the Balkan Peninsula in the 1920s, usually in the autumn. And 2 particular visits stand out in 1926 and 1929, and they are critical for this book and for the understanding of that painting, which initiated the book. So this is a painting that, this is a book that starts with one work of art, but it spans out and crosses all kinds of different media and all kinds of different questions about aesthetics. Now, its journey is a bit unconventional, a bit like mine, I suppose. And if I just take you back a slide, I include there a lot of work by other artists who are somehow influenced or somehow overlap, somehow show senses of identity, womanhood, modern sensibilities, at the same time as the Newberys, but go off in different directions. And one of those, perhaps who could be regarded as the last student of Fra Newbery, was Helen Muspratt, who became a very important photographer. And she lived in Swanage, had also lived in Cambridge, and her work was just fully encouraged by Fra. So he designs her photographic studio in Swanage, and he uses her as a model. He writes to her from his Balkan trips and from other trips, actually. And I pick up on that correspondence. Actually, the word correspondence is critical for the whole book. The patterns that they make and the correspondence between things, between cultures, but also the correspondence they actually engage in, is also a kind of departure point alongside Serbian Women, the painting. So I picked up, because the Newbery descendants, the family, very generously shared with me a lot of the correspondence that they had had, particularly with their two daughters, Elsie and Mary, and also they shared their collection of postcards. Now, those postcards they would keep, they would send. Some they sent to Muspratt, some they sent to the young Mary Spencer Watson, who was also their student, possibly as much as Jessie's as Fra's, because Jessie was encouraging her, I think, in terms of all kinds of paths she might take, but together they encouraged her to become a sculptor. But they also, for example, encouraged her love of horses, which is another story. Anyway, so I weave these things into this fabricated story that I tell, this narrative. The idea of the Balkans is fraught with contentious opinions, ideas, notions of what it is, and many people who live there, many people who live outside of this peninsula will dispute what it is and where that line that I've drawn on the map that I use, which was a 1930 map, so of the era, and I put that in the book early on. It's contentious. And you can see from that map that what was previously all kinds of different states had by this time, in around the end of the 1920s, become Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Albania in the main, and a bit of Turkey, and the Ottomans had, well, no longer the Ottomans, but Turkey had survived there. Now, in a way, Fra and Jessie were heading, at least on the 1926 trip to the Balkans, to Constantinople, to Istanbul. And there we know that Fra, for example, bought and was very proud of a leather-bound Quran. And that shows his actually extremely diverse thinking about beauty and culture. I think he was not limited in any ways, and we'll see that through the journey I take you on now. The journey has about 6 surviving so-called Serbian, I put them in inverted commas very often because it's a hot potato, but he very often called his paintings Serbian, or added the word Serbian to his titles, which he sometimes changed between exhibits. Now, he was exhibiting across Britain, and by the 1920s, particularly in Scotland, but previous to that, he had also organized Scottish international exhibition sections across Europe. And that meant that he was well acquainted with the exhibitions, for example, in Turin in 1902 and Paris in 1900. He also, together with Jessie, went to the Paris 1925 exhibition just before he went to Yugoslavia. And I'll show you one of the postcards they bought there. So this idea of them being drawn south, drawn to the Mediterranean and the Aegean and the Adriatic is part of a program of theirs. They were never going to really retire after they had left Glasgow School of Art. Another departure point, there's lots of departure points, was for me Stanley Spencer. Now Stanley Spencer, as we know, did some Clyde dockyards paintings, but he also went to the Balkans during the First World War. And during that time, well, actually afterwards, he was commissioned by the UK, the British Ministry of Information, to paint a commemorative image that's now for a long time, it's been in the Imperial War Museum, celebrating, if you like, probably the wrong word, but the catastrophe of the First World War, but also in a way, the British interventions there. Now, Spencer had actually backed off being an active participant, a soldier in the World War, but he had joined the kind of the hospital staff. And we should remember there were a lot of Scottish nurses who had a critical role to play in fostering actually the relationship with Greater Serbia, if you like, the Kingdom of Serbia, Croats and Slovenes, at the beginning of the during the 1418 war. So Spencer is summing that relationship up, and in the middle 20 teens, I went to Spencer's studio on the Thames, and I saw an advertisement to contribute, in a way, to an anthology of poems about his work. And it struck me that I should write a poem and, a bit like Fra, do my own kind of flitting between, and actually Jessie, because she also worked in metalwork, she taught mosaic, she wasn't just an embroiderer or needlework specialist, she worked in multiple media. So I moved to poetry, and I published that poem, Vadarets Vadaris, in the 2016 anthology of poems dedicated to the painter Spencer. And so my poem was about the folly of that war, and I tried to visually analyze this painting. And then I thought, well, actually what Fra and Jessie Newbery do is something totally different. They're not concerned with war. They're more concerned with peace and the bringing together of cultures. Maybe this is too, in a way, but this is kind of a bit dodgy. And I was concerned that the fluctuating interest in the Balkans that was expressed in Britain politically during the First World War, the expression of interest was really high. And Serbia was regarded as a great ally, and Britain a great ally of Serbia. Suddenly, after the war, that was lost. And that was only really during the Second World War that it refound a relationship, and exhibitions started to happen again, as the Mesterovic exhibition in 1915 in the V&A in London, and his continuing exhibiting in Britain had shown as a beginning point of that relationship. There had been earlier exhibitions prior to 1910, but they're one in Earl's Court or the White City in London, for example. But on the whole, there was very little interest. And so I was concerned that the interest in Yugoslavian, if we can call it that, art was politically motivated. But the Newberys transcended that interest. And they really transcended it through their expression of hybridization. I think we could call it hybridization of cultures and ideas. So that hybridization, in a way, starts with Serbian Women, the painting by Fra Newbery in the McManus in Dundee. Now, that painting with two women in so-called national costumes sitting with distaff and spindle on a bench. Now that's, you could, as I did in this book, I studied the iconography of it, the wider iconography of women with distaffs, and the idea of the woman with being representative of the distaff side, if you like, while the man is representative in some conceptions, historical conceptions, as the spear side. So there's those historical conceptions which in many ways such a painting adheres to rather than breaking away from. And in that, the iconography is following medieval, if not earlier, prototypes. But Fra was also following a prototype in Dundee that Matthew Jarron knows very well about, Nell Baxter's. This sketch of John Duncan's Spirit of Dundee mural, which is on Magdalen Green. And we only have the sketch, it seems. Maybe Matthew can tell us more about this. But it was published in the Piper of Dundee in 1900. And it was a salient image that quite possibly Fra knew of, because Fra was lecturing in Dundee at this time, and it's not by chance his picture was then donated to Dundee, because he understood the textile history of Dundee and how critical it had been for its modern development. But also he uses this kind of medievalist, romantic view of womanhood that Duncan had done very early on in 1900, and they were associated with one another. Fra continued that when he painted the friezes, and the central element of which, the fragment of which I show you on the bottom left, the Spirit of Bridport, for Bridport Town Hall, at the same time that he's going to Yugoslavia, to the Balkans, and he's working on this. And it's a huge, he fills the whole hall. I mean, Bridport is not a big town, and the town hall's not big, but still he fills this upper chamber with his friezes of all the different kinds of crafts, of industry that were typical of historical Bridport. And so he gives an identity, and the centerpiece is this Spirit of Bridport, this woman, a princess or queen, if you like, with her distaff and spindle. And so he then transfers that to the Serbian women. But the Serbian women, I discovered, well, they're not Serbian. And their dress is not even Serbian. And I'm really thankful to a lot of people for actually pointing out to me all the intricate details of their hybrid dress. Now, I might quote actually what it is, otherwise I'll probably get it wrong, from what I was told. So this is a compilation of what I was told by people working in the ethnographic museums in Belgrade, in Zagreb, and the Applied Arts Museum in Belgrade, and elsewhere. So this is quoting myself, and deriving my ideas of the costumes from my sources. Serbian Women features two costumes from neighboring areas of Old Serbia, northern western Macedonia, one from Kumanova on the left of the painting, the other from Blatia or Vodna in the upper Vardar region, some 160 kilometers south of Niš. Now I'm going to come to Niš in a moment. when I quote Jessie's letter to her daughters, or letters to her daughter. Jessie had purchased some fine examples of Macedonian or old Serbian dress there, including the linen or hemp koshula, the chemise, the zubun vest, the pegracha apron, and a pair of apanchi or moccasin-type sandals, some of which you see in this painting. The dress of the woman on the right, which is to reappear in other Newbery works, features a painterly interpretation of the 9-flower motif that characterizes much of Macedonian chemise sleeve embroidery. With this and the other embroidered parts of the dress, cuffs and hem, as well as their aprons, Balkan women was said to gain protection against the entry of evil spirits. Now, the intricate and extensive needlework is comprised of mainly red and black threads with accents of green, whose color would initially have derived from locally sourced vegetable dyes. Yes, the actual apron of the woman on the left has survived, and it's in a private collection. The family know which one. And it's thick red bands and rows of intricate red zigzag and star forms standing out from the bleached linen, and they're rendered in the painting with a kind of painterly flourish by Fra. Now, that was a great discovery when I went to visit the collection and with my colleague Shona Callistrup, and we came across this incredible apron and put two and two together quickly and quickly understood the painting. But I want to say that this also ties in with Jessie's letters. Now, this also suggests a notion of kind of civilization that she was dealing with. She never had a sense of hierarchy. She never, in the arts, in cultures at all. She wrote to her daughters in 1926, the autumn of 1926, the following, the first letter from the Palace Hotel in Niš, Serbia. 29th of September, a day in this queer little borderland town between the West and the East. Fascinating orangey brown sheepskin coats with the fur inside and appliqued with thinner black leather and bright green, pink, yellow, blue, red showing through punch holes in the back. Prototypes, very primitive, of our Lillian Skinner sandal. A whole street where they are made. And in Belgrade, we also had something called yogurt, a kind of curdled milk with sugar, delicious. I just had a yogurt before we started, so it's spread since then. Anyway, then the next letter from Belgrade, 25th of October in 1926. The journey was a long one. We're here, which we didn't expect to be, but I'm very pleased about. As with the museum and the market and the view of the Great Plain from on high, it's a fine place to be. And the small 2-story Belgrade houses that remain are very attractive. Handmade carpets about here are very interesting. The helems. I bought 2 articles of apparel that you'll see when you come to Corf. I would like to buy some more, but they're very dear. In Sofia, we acquired some braid in emerald, cobalt, yellow, scarlet, and some bowls. Are you pleased? In Niš, we found black pottery with gold encrustations. I got one, and I got a lovely coat, Rodier fabric, camel haired, stiff, with a little diaper of real gold, hardly tailored. The scarf goes through a slot, and one end hangs down behind. Very long, no fur at the neck. She was really into dress reform. She was one of the most progressive women thinkers for freeing up what women were wearing, and that's shown, as I will show you in a second, by her relationship with Anna Mutesius. Okay, let's move on from that. The next delight that I came across in this, a different private family collection, but had been handed down by Jessie and by Fra as well, I also found was in a painting. Now, this painting initially was called A Serbian Musician when Fra exhibited, and in Paisley, in Glasgow, possibly also in Edinburgh, maybe in Newcastle as well. But when I went to Dorchester, to the Dorset County Museum, and I got them to unlock their stores, and there they pulled out this large painting, it's almost life-size. It was super to see it in reality, and to see that waistcoat, that Liebeck waistcoat, was brilliant. Now, let me just again do a very quick citation about the waistcoat. Okay, page 77. Yeah. Now, he called this a Serbian musician. Sometimes it changes the title, but that was what it was mostly called. Now, it's actually a portrait of David Brindley. Now, Brindley was a very flamboyant opera singer who settled with his partner, Norman Notley, also a singer and a musician, very close to Corfe Castle in the 20s. And Brindley in particular was almost like fostered by the Newberys. He was their favorite son in a way, and he was always there in their Corfe house, eating with them, talking to them, talking about art and music, etc., and organizing, writing for them music, actually. So he was very often on the BBC, and there are some recordings of him singing. He also had a talking program. Anyway, he's shown as a Serbian musician, full length, turning to us, 3/4 frontal profile. He wears Croatian dress, replete with embroidered Liebeck waistcoat, skrilak hat, frula or jedinka pipe, but probably Serbian opanci, those sandals on his feet. His shepherd-like appearance is completed by the satchel, which looks very similar to the basket holding the spindle of wound wool on the bench in Serbian Women. Now, Brindley's attire definitely derived from the Newbery collection. And I go into what that waistcoat is about. I won't go into the details now, but I was really helped by the curators from the ethnographic museums with this. And also, Sansom reproduced these images really nicely in the book. So this also tied in with Brindley and Newbery, as the Newberys actually, also working on a pageant associated with Fra's painting of a new town or village sign for the center of Corfe Castle. Now, this was a sign celebrating Saint King, the teenage King Edward of Essex, the martyr king, who had been killed in Corfe Castle in 979. And so Fra painted this heart of the village, really, this sign, and organized the pageant with lots of school children parading from the village school down the main streets to the center, and then Brindley, who you see there on the left, conducting his own music, and he'd written the libretto as well. Fra had written the pageant and published it, and actually George Rawson, who's the only person to have published on Fra Newbery 2 excellent small booklets, but he wrote a great PhD. And I wish George was still around today so that he could hear me, because in many ways I would like to pay homage to him as a pioneer of the study of Fra Newbery's art, because without his help, I wouldn't have been able to write this book either. But sadly, he passed away just after I had finished the book, but he had read the manuscript, thankfully. Anyway, we talked at length about what Fra did throughout his career, and George really helped me. But in a way, I also complemented George's research by focusing on this later period. George had also worked in Dorset and produced a lovely booklet about his Dorset period and upbringing there. So you see Fra Newbery in the white hat on the right-hand side of the picture on the left, and you see next to him Mary Spencer Watson and her mother Hilda in Serbian, Croatian shepherds, if you like, costumes. Now that same waistcoat that Mary is wearing had just been painted here in 1927, the same year. Maybe, I don't know which came first, actually, the musician painting or the pageant, because they're both in 1927. Anyway, that waistcoat was doing its rounds. Yes, in the close-up, you can see it a bit better. It's covered on my screen because I've got a funny little icon of who's in the meeting covering my. Perhaps I can move that somewhere else. Further down. Yeah, so I can see a bit more of what you're seeing. Okay. Now, that also came, the creation of this pageant and sign came after Fra had produced an altarpiece for the Roman Catholic Church of the Holy Spirit and St. Edward in Swanage, where his last student, Helen Muspratt, was to be based and was based by this time. And that altarpiece, as its central panel, was very, very similar to the village sign that he created for Corfe Castle. Now, in that project, which I'll come to in a moment, in the church, there is essentially a very late blossoming of the Glasgow style. Obviously, after Fra and Jessie have left the Glasgow School of Art and moved to Dorset, but it is because they did so much of the decoration of the church, and they did it in a Glasgow style way, a collaborative way with two other artists, actually. It's super, and I really recommend a visit there. Unfortunately, Fra's design of Helen Muspratt's studio, done about the same time, hasn't survived. You can just see the front of the shop where she had, which has survived, also Glasgow style. Anyway, what we see in this, again, these photographs of the pageant, we see probably the same dress, Macedonian dress, on the pageant queen in the center of the picture on the left. And we see the Spencer Watson mother and daughter as Amazons. They were described as Amazons in Fra's program, charging down the Corfe streets at the front of the procession. Now, this coincides with Fra moving to other Serbian subjects in his painting, and he frees them up. We know he's fabricating. The first one, he has a local model standing in his studio, clearly. She's not really winding wool or yarn from her distaff to a spindle. She's in his studio, and she's a model. Likewise, on the right, it's more painterly, and the brushwork is freer, but still that costume, that dress, is probably the same dress as we've seen in Serbian Women. And that dress is to appear again, and it appears in the church in what encapsulates for me the culmination of Fra's work, and it's the Annunciation, part of another altarpiece in the Church of the Holy Spirit in St. Edward in Swanage. Now here we see the spinning Virgin, and she's in front of a Balkan ciborium. She is spinning, and I go in my book into all kinds of ideas about that idea of procreation that she represents of Christ, and also this Annunciation, and how Fra is playing with it in many different ways. But I also talk about his models, as I do with his Serbian women painting, because despite the Balkan appearance of the Madonna here, Gabriel and one of his assistant angels, if you like, is actually Helen Muspratt, and she appears twice, the left-hand little angel and Gabriel. So we see here a blending of local Corf, or Swanage, Purbeck, if you like, and the Balkan. That's fine. And I go into the details of that. Now, I have to say that actually the way this figure on the right wears her headscarf, I mentioned this already, as the other figure also wears hers, is not what I would associate with Serbia or the Balkans. It's a fantasy. In fact, it may be more Dorset than anything else. And that is fitting because these are not Serbian women. They are from Corfe Castle. And they're almost, George Rawson and I talked about this at length. We think that they are the Orchards, mother and daughter. Forgotten the daughter's first name, Emily maybe, Orchard. Anyway, she was a favorite model of Fra's in Corfe Castle. So these actually are Dorset women as much as anything else. But I also analysed some of the sources that Jessie noted in her notes, and this was one of them, Bossert's Volkskunst in Europa. She made a note, I don't know whether she got it, but she definitely made, I've seen it in her handwriting on one of her cards, about this book. And then when I looked that through, I bought a copy of it through the book, I discovered on plate 85, which is a big plate, it's got various different images, these images, and they're images of embroidery, hem and sleeve motifs from Vodna, Macedonia. So that fits, again, with the idea. Macedonian, Northern Macedonian embroidery is regarded as the best by many of the Balkan embroidery. It's the strongest in some ways. It's the epitome. I don't want to stereotype like that, but it has that reputation. If you read Rebecca West, who I write about in my book, and her Black Lamb and Grey Falcon eulogy, if you like, to Yugoslavia, you will find the Macedonian embroidery really elevated. I analyze her interpretation in the book as well. Anyway, I have to say that Fra and Jessie had a long relationship with embroidery and this representation of the modern woman as well as the traditional woman. And I try to draw this out in the book. And that's nowhere better expressed than in the image, the painting of his, called The Embroideress, but actually a portrait of Anna Mutesius. Now, the Newberys were great friends with Herman and Anna Mutesius in London. And they were living in London, they were German. Herman Mutesius was an envoy, a cultural attaché in the German embassy in London, and Anna Mutesius was writing and working as a modern needle worker in many ways. She wrote this book about the personal dress, Das Eigenkleid der Frau, which she published in 1903. It's a Glasgow-style product in many ways. Francis MacDonald McNair did the cover with some attachments, textile attachments on the cover. Very interesting. A bit ruined in the copy that I got the cover of to reproduce in the book. But also featured in the book were the Newbery girls, Elsie and Mary, in dresses, free dresses, designed by Jessie Newbery. Now, in the book, I do pick apart Jessie's creed or credo. She didn't write much in terms of publishing her text, but I did pick out of her letters and one article, one interview she gave in the studio very early on, her ideas. So you can read that. I put all her correspondence and all her publications relating to art, along with Fra's, as many of his as I could, in the appendices in the book. Anyway, moving on. Fra had been born actually in Devon, and he was the son of a kind of village shoemaker, cobbler, and a dressmaker. So he was born into the crafts, and then he studies actually at South Kensington schools. He went to school in Bridport in Dorset, hence his connection there later on. But his real schooling is in South Kensington, which becomes the V&A, of course. And then from there, he moves to the Glasgow School of Art, where he just rises to such prominence, but historical negligence in many ways. Anyway, from his very early paintings, whether he's painting Devonians or the Paisley Shawl or the Lady of the Carnation, as you see in the right, is an interest in fabric, in dress, in female dress. He also does male dress. I reproduce one or two of his male dresses, but I concentrate on the way he represents female dress because that is really what he's mainly concerned with in his depictions of what is Serbian in his interpretation. But we can see this prehistory, this interest, and the move on the right. There's a dress there designed, made probably by Jessie, that I think stayed in the family for a while, the Lady of the Carnation, now in the Lang Gallery in Newcastle. Anyway, some of those postcards, I was a bit heretical and started, the first chapter is mainly concerned with postcards and postcard art. And that's quite interesting way to deal with fine art and craft. And I looked at the cards that the Newberys had collected, had sent, and the way these costumes represented different cultures. And you can see on your screen, I won't go into details now because I haven't got time, but some examples of those cards that they collected. I loved them. I picked them apart as much as I could. I tried to understand them and show that they are also fabrications. I mean, these are collages, and they are fabrications about national identity within new states or changing states, particularly the new Italy and the way that Zara or Zandar had been part of Venice, if you like, and that Lion Gate of Venice behind, and also it had been Austrian, which they're looking towards, the Austrian barracks and fort on the left, but they've been kind of superimposed on this, and they're probably Dalmatian peasant women from the location, but nowhere are they actually identified, just like Fra doesn't identify them, it just says Serbian, and that's it, but it's not accurate at all. And it's the same with the postcard of the local women shown in Piana del Grezzi, but these are actually the Albanians of Sicily, who actually were they belonged to the Orthodox creed, so they were Eastern Christians and not Muslim women, very famous for their embroidery. So they also collected postcards, and this is an example at the 1925 World Exhibition of Decorative Art in Paris. And this struck me when I saw the family collection, that they collected these musicians from the Garala peoples living in the Tatra highlands. And these musicians came to represent Poland, even though they could be regarded as Slovakian. They're kind of beyond being just Polish ethnic ethnicities. So their culture was being assimilated by Poland in the 1920s. and represented outside a very modernist, very interesting, almost Art Deco pavilion. But that didn't seem to capture the Newberys' eye. What caught them was the postcard of the musicians in their costumes. I also relate more postcards, Nasta Rojic, a Croatian artist, that were in their collection, Maximilian Vanka, another Croatian artist, and I deal with how these deal with costumes, modern women, traditional women. Nasta Rojic is very interesting. She lived with a woman, Alexandrine Onslow, a British woman who came to the Balkans as a nurse, and they became partners, and they lived part of the time in Britain, actually, and toured a lot of Britain. Vanka was trained, he was Croatian, but he was trained in Brussels by Jeanne Delville, who had been brought to Glasgow and had just left Glasgow, where he'd spent 7 years teaching painting under Fra Newbery. So maybe the Newberys met Vanka. They certainly bought his card while they were in Zagreb in 1929. Anyway, I deal with the importance of the umbrella too in the book. Other images that echo the iconography of Serbian women I pick apart. Some, of course, are actually Scottish, some are Croatian. But I also relate that interest in the Balkans to Patrick Geddes, and although he dies just after its establishment, his Le Play Society sends whole kind of mixtures of biologists, geographers, sociologists to study the cultures of Europe in a new form of study, a study that is really regionalist. It wants to connect, find the correspondences again, the patterns between place, work, folk. As you can see, I don't know who designed this logo, but it became prominent in publications for Geddes's Le Play Society in the early 1930s and the mid-1930s. And the leading light in the Le Play Society was Fanny Copeland, the daughter of the Royal Astronomer at the Royal Observatory in Edinburgh. And so that photograph that you see on the right of Fanny in supposedly in Serbian national dress, again, that is moot. And I'm not sure where she is. It looks a bit like Zagreb to me. I'm not sure, but she's settled in Ljubljana, which capital of Slovenia now. But she was an actual real force for Britain coming to understand the Southern Slav nationalities. And she taught English in the university in Ljubljana for 20 years after the First World War. But she was a prime mover for the Kosovo Emergency Committee during the First World War and gave talks. She dressed in national costume. Don't know how she found it. And she published about it. And I reproduced some of her thoughts about it. So she's another woman who's leading this charge for understanding Balkan identities and trying to transcend boundaries through that. She is followed in a smaller way, but no less important way in the way I think I try to interpret it, by a Glasgow girl, De Courcy Luthwaite Dewar. And she and her sister Kathleen go on Le Play Society trips to Romania, to Slovenia, and De Courcy Luthwaite Dewar is employed by Fra Newbery in the Glasgow School of Art, actually mainly to be a metalwork teacher. He was really advanced in his attempt to include women as teachers in the arts and break down all kinds of different boundaries. So she goes and she becomes the artist for Le Play Societies. And so my example here is two images of hers from the Romania East Carpathian studies that they published in the 1930s. And again, the frontispiece is a woman in costume, local costume, with a distaff and spindle, so spinning yarn. And even on the right side, you can see her sitting outside a farmstead in Cordoba. So very interesting that, this comes just after Fra had done the same. So there was this kind of study of ways that actually were under threat through the machine age, through the move to, industrialized production and less handicraft. So those artists who wanted to make sure there was a nice balance remaining included really the Newberys' greatest prodigy, in my opinion, perhaps more so than Luthwaite Dewar, Anne Macbeth. Anne Macbeth, who moved to the Lake District and became a very important writer there, as well as craftswoman, while she took over the needlework from Jessie and worked very closely with her and was more of an activist. They were both activists in the suffragette movement, for example, but she was really outspoken. Maybe, I think she even got arrested. And she would produce these publications with her own work. And I include some of the ways she might connect with the Balkans, as she actually writes a little bit about Serbia in her numerous books. Another way I make the connection, again, is with Bulgaria. And I won't dwell on this. I think you've had enough of me by now. I've gone over my time. But Bulgarian treatment of Macedonia is very interesting, and the way that the German royalty, new royalty in Macedonia, in Bulgaria, were trying to assimilate Macedonia, actually. And there was a kind of internecine battle going on. The royalty started dressing up their princesses in kind of Bulgarian national costume, again with distaff and spindles, now a photograph. And Valcho Antonov reproduced that photograph in his book published in Berlin in 1917. But unlike the Macedonian kind of woman or women in Serbian Women by Fra Newbery, this woman is a Macedonian slave, and she doesn't have a distaff and spindle. You can see, you might not see very well in the reproduction on your screen, her hands are actually shackled. She's chained, and she's trying to break free. But so hers is a lamentation, a pieta, if anything, rather than an annunciation. Now, all this, and I'll wind up now, all this ties in with what I try to introduce in I think towards the end of the book, in terms of how, in a way, retrospective Fra and Jessie's look, and maybe those of the Le Play Society, was in terms of Balkan cultures, because women were actually leading movers of progressive ideas and art. And one instigator of that was Nadezhda Petrović. She, for me, is an absolute icon of Serbian painting. She is an expressionist, if you like, but she is a force to be reckoned with. She dies in the First World War. She becomes a nurse. She gets ill and dies in a hospital, which she paints. But she has such power. And so you could see her as an alternative viewer of Serbian or Yugoslavian culture to that represented by Fra Newbery, or Jessie Newbery as well. And you can see that in the force of her colours. So I chose two images that kind of play with his David Brinley, Serbian musician, and his Serbian woman. There she was also a photographer. She photographed her own sister, Anda, in a kind of pre-Raphaelite pose. You can see how modern she is in her dress. Petrović is a leader. And how distant is this from that folkish kind of representation that Fra was representing? and representing even in his David Brindley Musprat. Anyway, I made the connection again with Mestrovich and his Annunciation and Shepherd. The Mestrovich, because the Newberys went to the Racic family mausoleum and sent a postcard to Helen Musprat from there. They were well kind of integrated with Balkan leading artists, or leading Balkan artists. And Mestrovich was probably at the pinnacle of the plastic arts, the sculptural arts. Petrovich, for my money, leading in many ways the painterly arts. But he was certainly at the pinnacle of the plastic arts. And he developed a disciple in London who was from Aberdeen, Jean Milne. And she wrote a eulogy to him for his 1919 monograph that came out in London, dedicated to him. Actually kind of introduced by his friend John Lavery. This was a great publication, a huge monograph actually, and Milne was critical for it. She went to see him in Yugoslavia. She knew him. She worked with him, and she stored some of his sculptures for him. And after visiting the Balkans, she turned herself from a sculptor to a textile artist. And her work I found in the Crafts Study Centre in Farnham and Surrey. But she also worked in Paxton House. She was related to the Robertsons in the borders of Scotland, and she brought a new kind of sense of weaving, free weaving, a modern weaving to the Highlands of Scotland too, in the interwar period. And I'll just zip through. I won't dwell on Annie Dickinson. It was lovely meeting or talking to her family. She was a leader, a leading light. Again, she'd gone out in the First World War, and she regarded herself as a reincarnated Serb. She wrote that or she gave that interpretation of herself in interviews for the Serbian press. She did exhibitions. She lived in Bosnia. She did exhibitions of upholstered furniture and her own furniture. And she started schools, art schools, very often for orphan children in different parts of Bosnia and Serbia. And finally, I'm going to end now with Jovicic, particularly Lena Jovicic. Now, I'm indebted particularly to Draginja Mascarelli for interpreting the costumes that you see on your screen. But Jovicic, and I won't dwell on that now, it's a fantastic way that Draginja sort of pulled out the hybrid costumes that they are wearing. And these were reproduced in Jovicic's English language books. Jovicic dressed herself and her sisters as Serbian kind of folk women, but they were half Serbian, half Scottish. Some of them were born in Belgrade, and some were born in London. Their mother was from Edinburgh. They spent quite a bit of time in Edinburgh, but they really, particularly Lena, was enamored of her Serbian heritage. And she encapsulates that not only in that photograph of herself and her sisters, but in other photographs. This hybrid identity comes out. So she does a very early review of a women's art association, the Svijeta Zuzoric Association, which gets going in the 1920s in Belgrade. And you can see from these historical photographs, including of Anna Marinkovic, who became the first president and was an artist, that these are very modern women. And they had exhibitions, the leading art exhibitions, including of Paris Masters, the very year, 1926. It opened actually on the same day that Jessie sent a letter to her daughters, an exhibition of Parisian masters. These women had opened that exhibition and they brought Picasso they had brought the Delaunis, examples of their work. They brought Zadkin to Belgrade. So what a contrast with the women represented in Fra and Jessie's kind of romantic views of Serbian identity. Yeah, and so I had a final already, but I do wind up at the end with going back to Jessie's journey, taking people through the warp and the weft of her journey, her needlework, her connection with literature, her romantic views, her modern views, her modern dresses that incorporate tradition as well. And then I really get to a kind of epilogue with Mira Crouch, and this is really my final word. I got to know Mira, who also, like George Rawson, sadly died. She was in, I think, her 90s while I was writing the book. And Mira said, who was living in Australia at this time, she said to me, look, I'll send you these two photographs that match, in a way, the journey you're taking in your book. They're of my mother, Jela. This is Jela on the left, and I quote Mira. Her real name is Miroslava, which kind of means glory to peace, and that's what I end with at the end. And it's so sad that she, like George, died just before publication. But anyway, I thought this transition from the modest woman, unmarried, on the left, alone, by the fence, perhaps in not exactly peasant dress, but still, you know, modest on the left, moving to become a flapper on the right, and in her new Belgrade society with her husband and actually Mira's uncle, who were Jewish, by the way, another hybridization, Serbian and Jewish identity, represented in their bow ties and suits. Now, the sadness of this hybrid identity, of course, that the uncle and aunt and many of Mira's family were wiped out in the Holocaust, in the deeply affected the Balkans. And Mira Crouch became a sociologist in Australia, and she passed so much of her wisdom on to me. I'm not sure I've retained it, any of it, but I try to impart some of it to my readers in my book, both at the beginning and the end. So she's a fitting way to, in a way, encapsulate what the Newberys also had tried to say. But she really summed up the way womanhood and what it meant to the Southern Slav people. And so I tried to do that. And it is, in a way, a memoir of migration, the whole book. So that's it. Thank you very much. Sorry, I went on far too long.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Fantastic presentation that represents so much dedicated scholarship on Fra and Jessie Newbery. It was fascinating to also find out about Dundee connection also. Fantastic presentation. We'd also like to wish you congratulations on your retirement. We're very honoured to have you present to us as your final academic lecture, so many thanks once again. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. A recording is available and we will circulate after the presentation. So many thanks and enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye now.
Thank you. Thanks everyone.